Hello, this is Kade, and today's video is different than anything I've done before, where before I've just been talking about ships and what I liked, what I didn't like, how I thought it could be working in game and from the lore and all that stuff. Today's video is by the title, as you can read. It's about addressing the balance in ship combat in Star Citizen without talking or touching on the flight model. Because the flight model is by many looked at as the problem child in the ship balancing, while in fact it is perhaps a factor, but it is most certainly not a critical factor that has caused the prolonged, like pretty much permanent imbalance we have seen within Star Citizen when it comes to the fighting in space. In order then to rebalance this combat, what we're going to be looking at today is a whole bunch of numbers. But these numbers are based upon concepts that are well known, well established within the virtual world space. So to understand these kind of numbers, you need to understand virtual worlds and their, by now, very lengthy history, but also their inherent complexity. A virtual world is a representation of our own world, just changed, but still representing a world. You only need to look at our own world to realize how complex things are. But you can also look at our own world and realize just how unfair our world is. And this unfairness is very important to have. And it's also important to understand that a lot of the things in the world that are like more balanced, in quotation marks, it's not in a one-to-one comparison. It is always looking at a group of items, group of things, a group of people, all combined together and seeing how those balance out. And this is also how you need to balance a virtual world. The one-on-one engagement in a virtual world setting is not something that you worry about when you're doing any form of balancing. They are going to be, by the inherent nature of being a virtual world, unbalanced. And that's completely fine. There is nothing wrong with a one-on-one engagement in being unbalanced and unfair. In fact, multiple people engaging each other, depending on the scenarios and what they bring, is most likely going to end up being unbalanced and unfair because one side just didn't have the right equipment. Remember the old adage, fair fights are for suckers. So we're not introducing then anything new. I'm also not going to be introducing anything groundbreaking. We're going to bake things that are completely unfun. I'm also not going to introduce things that make no sense, as it has to make sense is one of my core rules whenever I write or create anything, whether that is lore or rule sets for virtual worlds, as I have been dabbling in that for quite some time alongside being a well-established virtual world nerd by now. I've been playing these things for a very long time and I've been analyzing them for a very long time. It is also not a concept that I just picked out of the air and did not have anybody check. In fact, I had one of the most well-regarded experts, I would say, in the virtual worlds have shared his thoughts a little bit when I explained it, and he was very much in agreement. So without further ado, let's stop looking at pretty starships and start looking at what some would call boring numbers. But if you want to understand the world, you need to understand the rules, and the rules are made with numbers. So we have for you a wonderful little thing known as a spreadsheet. Spreadsheets are at the core of so many things in life, and well, this is not going to be any exception. So what I'm going to show you with this spreadsheet is the requirement to look at Star Citizen like a traditional MMO, where, you know, depending on the scenario, you are unlikely to stand a chance in a combat scenario, or you may have a very, very good chance in a combat scenario, depending on which side you're on. Now, in order to do this, we have to bring in a sort of a tier system. In traditional style virtual worlds, like in the fantasy worlds, of course, you have your tier system in levels, and you have your tier systems in your equipment. So generally, the higher level and the higher gear you are, the better off you're going to be in any encounter. Now, of course, in a PvP setting, there's going to be a cap on how big that difference can be. But in a PvE setting, if you're going to be fighting a raid boss, that raid boss is going to be massively, massively, massively more powerful than you are. Which means that a equal tier raid boss, like, the current expansion or whatever in the game, you're probably not going to be fighting that one solo. Unless the developers fucked up something, but generally that's just not going to happen. It will win that engagement all the time. We have similar things in Installed Citizen, as you will see shortly. So we need to have different tiers. Now we do this here for the weapons, and they are being shown here with static numbers. So let's say each tier still does only 100 DPS. However, this number is not as static as you may think, as we'll show later. We have what I call a dynamic number, which is just a number that takes the previous number and multiplies it by a factor as we entered on top here. And we do exactly the same thing for the shields. Now the shields you can also have as a analog for the whole HP as well. Of course, they want to introduce the Maelstrom system, which actually allows them to do some other really cool stuff, which I will talk about towards the end. We do have hull tiers here as well, but these are primarily for the turret systems. So there's a rate of fire option here, and there's a projectile velocity list here. Now this projectile velocity list is not going to be used in energy calculations. It's simply there as an example of one of the things that is needed for the turrets, along with a rate of fire. So then we have the options to enter a whole bunch of numbers here for two ships, unit alpha, unit beta, and we can give them ship weapons, and we can give them turret weapons. Now you'll notice that the turret weapon list is a little bit longer than the ship weapon list, and that is because we are of course looking at this rate of fire modifier over here, which is what is going to make turrets again more dangerous in the correct scenario. All of this then comes to take a look at the shield and hull tiers over here that we enter and finally calculates out in a lovely list here that shows you the damage that is going to be applied and the time to kill that it would result in. So let's start with a very simple scenario. We have two ships, they both have two tier 1 weapons, they are tier 1 shields, hull tier 1s, and that's all that's going to be in the factor up here. Well, with this system, with only tier 1 being applied, the static and dynamic is going to be the same because we start at 1 and 1 is always going to be the same. And we see that we end up with a theoretical time to kill in this scenario of 5 seconds. Now it is important to understand here, of course, that these numbers are the classic example of a placeholder. And also if this says 5 seconds, that is 5 seconds of 100% damage application. If you play Star Citizen, you know that a lot of your shots will never hit. So you start to understand that 5 seconds is not going to be 5 seconds. But it will still give you a very good indication of where the balance is going to be. Now let's say we're going to be tweaking our unit beta systems here. And we're going to give that one a shield tier of 3. So this is maybe it's an Argon Mole, like it's a larger ship. So shield tier 3, hull tier 3, it's a larger ship, it doesn't really have a lot of firepower, but its defenses are higher, being an industrial unit and a larger vessel. So what we end up now with is that unit alpha hasn't changed, the weapons haven't changed, but the shield has changed. And here we can see suddenly that our time to kill has gone up drastically, while the damage has gone down, because that's of course the result here. So damage has gone down, and for the dynamic shields, the shield hit points have gone up, of course creating a perfect storm of massively increasing the time to kill. Now why did the damage go down? Because we haven't changed the weapons, but we changed the shield. So in a system like this, the game would actually look at the size of weapon that's being used to impact the size of shield. And it will take from that a differentiation factor. So if the weapon size is smaller, the weapon will do less damage to that shield because it is less powerful, and the shield being inherently stronger can just resist that weapon fire better. If it's going to be the other way around, what we're suddenly going to see is an increase in the damage application, because the weapon is much more powerful than the shield tier is, So the shield tier just will struggle to fight off a much more powerful weapon. So let's say for giggles, we're just going to give Unit Alpha some tier 5 weapons. And suddenly the game changes around again. And we see that the time to kill numbers drastically decrease. So this is how you would start to balance Star Citizen's ships. Because with a system like this, what happens is that you can look at any given ship in the game, you will know which tier of ship that is, which tier of weapons that ship has, and you can calculate from that very quickly without really needing to think all that much about it, whether or not an engagement is going to be favorable for you. What it also means is that if you are flying a larger ship and people show up with a bunch of small ships, they are no longer really all that dangerous to you anymore, while in fact your return fire may be a lot more dangerous. And to show that, let's go ahead and give our beta unit over here a bit of an upgrade. So we're gonna go call this one now a hammerhead. So roughly say it's a tier 7 system. We're going to put down our fighter. This is going to be a light fighter, so we're going to give it a single size 2 weapon, and it's going to have 2 size 1 weapons. Fairly light fighter weapon loadout. Now, of course, a hammerhead has turrets of size 4 weapons. So it has size 4 tier weapons on there, and there's 24 of those to be found on the hammerhead. So now if we take a look over in our calculation corner, we can see the time to kill. And we can see that this has drastically changed. So going from a 5 seconds here on an equal system, we're suddenly down to literally in the hundreds of seconds. And this is what you want to see, because this makes a whole lot of sense. You're looking at a platform that is purposely designed to swat fighters out of the sky. With this kind of damage application, it would really swat fighters out of the sky. And of course, the issue is also there is like, hey, fighters, they move very quickly, they stay out of range, which is why we increase both the rate of fire and the projectile velocity. Because with the way that the weapons now work in Star Citizen, they're firing a cone of projectiles. What you're then trying to do is I'm trying to saturate an area of space with weapons fire. In order to do that effectively, the weapons fire needs to be fast enough to get within an area of space which can still be occupied by an enemy fighter. And there needs to be enough weapons fire within that area of space that it is actually going to be effective. So while the damage may look absolutely ridiculous, at the ranges where a fighter probably is going to be, it is actually going to be far more reasonable. But it will still mean that for that fighter, getting close within weapons range of a hammerhead should be pretty much effectively an instant death sentence. The ship is designed to shoot down fighters, so you don't want to get close to it in a fighter. That fight is meant to be unfair and unbalanced. If you want to kill the hammerhead then with smaller ships, you would bring torpedo bombers. They are designed, purposefully so, to bring to the battlefield a much larger weapon, but in a far more limited quantity, and at an increased cost for the use of that weapon. And that's how you start to balance out the systems all around. So this is of course a fairly extreme one. But if we say take a look at an example of say a more heavy fighter against a light fighter. So we're going to be bringing in our light fighter maintains that, and our heavy fighter is going to bring in 2 size 4 weapons. It's going to bring in 4 size 3 weapons, and it's going to have 2 size 2 weapons. Really solid heavy fighter over here. And we take a look over here then back to our calculations. Like yeah, the light fighter technically, like this is probably the one you should be looking at, because these are just examples, but this is the primary one. The light fighter technically still can kill the heavy fighter, and in a one-on-one engagement, it likely still will kill the heavy fighter, simply because it can stay out of the heavy fighter's weapon fire. The heavy fighter simply cannot apply its damage to the light fighter, because the light fighter is faster and more agile. We are not changing that aspect of the game because, again, that needs to be there. It has to make sense. So in this one-on-one engagement, it is inherently unfair, even though on paper, the heavy fighter has far better stats in the damage output and tanking capability than a light fighter does. Now, where it starts to get interesting is when we start to multiply the numbers of ships on the field. Because, of course, being able to dodge the fire one-on-one, that's relatively easily. But when you need to start dodging fire from 2 incoming weapon sources, or let alone 3 incoming weapon sources, you start to see that this scenario starts to change very, very quickly. Even the best light fighter pilots are going to struggle to avoid incoming fire from different directions from 3 other fighters at the same time. And the heavy fighters being able to tank the damage output from the light fighters for a substantially longer period of time actually have the luxury, in say 3-on-3 engagement, to focus all of their fire on one of the enemies and ignoring 2 of the other enemies. Because they know that they can take a couple of hits, and while they are taking those hits, they know that they can remove one of the opposing team's fighters. And of course, once one of those has gone down, the heavy fighters are slowly taking some damage, but they start to focus on another one, meaning that that one needs to go evasive. Only one of them is still shooting at them. And probably by the end of it, all 3 heavy fighters would survive the encounter. Maybe one of them will have some damage. Or maybe if they're really unlucky, one of them got killed as well. But the end result of that engagement in nearly all scenarios would be that indeed the more powerful ship is going to win the engagement. As it should be. Now, you may say this is unfair, and again, yes it is. It's designed to be unfair, but also you're flying the light fighters. Why are you taking that engagement? You knew in advance that was going to be a bad engagement. Once you got into the engagement, you're still flying the light fighter, so you would have been able to get out of the engagement. So you continuing to be there and hence losing the engagement, like the unfairness in that is more so in your own stupidity than in anything else. You choose to take that engagement, which was a losing battle from the start. And this is where it's so important to realize these kinds of things. To look at a game and be like, okay, I need to make it unfair. And through making it unfair, I am actually making it balanced. Because now I start to look at every single scenario, and depending on the size of the scenario, the complexity is going to rapidly increase. Because I'm going to need these different ships to do different things. Light fighters, like these interceptors, are really good at chasing after, say, a mantis that is tackling your fleet. A medium fighter may be able to do it, probably will struggle, and a heavy fighter is never going to catch that thing. So, say I'm flying in escort of a Hull E, and I got a hammerhead, and I bring 2 lightnings. And the pirates show up, and they have a tackle ship. And they just have a couple of medium fighters. But they have enough medium fighters where 2 heavy fighters are going to be like they're outnumbered. So say they have 6 medium fighters. It's not an engagement that the heavy fighters want to take. So they don't want to leave the protective bubble of their hammerhead. The problem is that there is a tackle ship out there. The other problem is, no, they have nothing within their force that can effectively engage that tackle ship. Meaning, they're being held in place until such a time either perhaps a ransom is being paid to the pirates, or the pirates have waited for their friends to show up with the heavy hitters to actually take out the hammerheads and then perhaps board and steal the entire Hull E. So they can just wait for a bunch of torpedo bombers or maybe a Perseus to show up on the field, destroy the hammerhead, and off they go. You did not bring a proper selection for escorting that Hull E. So if all you had were those 9 people that you had, probably maybe the hammerhead alone was not the best idea. Or alternative, maybe instead of bringing those heavy fighters, you brought the hammerhead and you brought 2 light fighters, whose goal simply was to chase off any tackle ships. Now this would have still been dangerous because the tackle ship of course could have then tried to stay close to its Hornet escort And, 6 Hornets against 2 Light Fighters, we're ending up back to that initial fighter engagement we just talked about. It's not going to end all that well for your 2 Light Fighters. So you start to see that the engagements are starting to become a lot more dynamic, and there's going to be a lot more thought having to be put into it, instead of just being like, whomever has the most Light Fighter pilots will win, because nobody else can touch them. We still may not be able to touch those Light Fighters very much, but whenever we do, with the appropriate equipment, they are going to die very quickly, or alternatively, they will choose not to engage us because they realize it's not a favorable engagement for them. So this is how you're going to be balancing out Star Citizen. And what you're seeing here, and these larger ships, is that essentially these large ships are starting to become your raid bosses. And that's completely fair, because they take up a really large amount of resources, both in-game as in people resources, in order to field those ships on the battlefield. And they need to be a logical force multiplier when used appropriately. If they're being misused, then of course, you can still exploit that. They still have their weaknesses. If people show up with a single Perseus, and you have a single tackle ship and two medium fighters, probably you can still whittle down its shields because it has dead spots in its anti-fighter coverage, and you may not be able to kill it because with the Maelstrom system you could easily make it so that smaller caliber weapons cannot penetrate higher tier hull armor. But perhaps you could disable its engines, shoot away from some of the lighter turrets or things like that, so you can render it slowly combat ineffective. You may think then, oh, but that's unfair for the Perseus, it's a big ship, it should win. No, it's a big ship with a purpose of killing big ships. It's not a big ship with a purpose of killing small ships. It has a weakness against small ships. Yes, it has 2 of those anti-fighter turrets and maybe some PDCs on there, but those are going to be having their limits. So they will have to understand the inherent limitations of their vessel, just like the light fighter pilot will have to do, and address it accordingly. So if I'm going to be flying into with a Perseus, I probably want to have an escort that can deal with enemy fighters and bombers, because I am vulnerable to those. If I'm flying a Hammerhead, I just need to worry about a Perseus or torpedo bombers or things like that. So my threat envelope is completely different. So that's for me it with this video, and hopefully you have gained some understanding in how you can rebalance a game like Star Citizen without actually needing to look at the big bugbear that so many people look at, being the flight model. Now, of course, changes can be made to the flight model to still make it better and all of that. I'm not saying that it's perfect right now. But what I'm trying to say here is that it is not the problem of the poor balancing in Star Citizen. The problem of the poor balancing in Star Citizen is that the current rule set, simply put, does not make any sense. It makes no sense that light fighters can kill the Hammerhead. When that's the scenario, you need to start to look at that actual scenario and be like, okay, how can I make sure that this makes sense? Well, with a system like this, with of course tweaking the numbers as they need to be tweaked, suddenly I'm turning that scenario from a light fighter kills Hammerhead into Hammerhead obliterates light fighter. Hey, that scenario makes sense. And you can start building up that. So take that one as a rule whenever you're writing or creating anything. Remember that it has to make sense. If it doesn't make sense, it will not work, and people will complain about it, people will notice it, and it's just going to become an unenjoyable experience. If you want to talk about this some more, if you have any questions, like I normally don't really care about it, I don't do much with my Discord server like at all, but if you have any questions or you do want to talk about it, by all means, drop down towards the Discord, and you can go ahead and take a look at it and talk to me about it, and discuss it if you have some other ideas. Of course, you can put down the comments here on YouTube, but we all know that YouTube comment sections are absolutely useless most of the time anyway. So if you really want to talk about some things seriously, drop on the Discord. And with that, I'm going to thank you very much for watching. I know that this is not the most of engaging of content for a lot of you, but I do hope that perhaps something like this hits a light bulb moment somewhere in CIG where they're like, oh wait, we do need to make some changes. And I really hope that they will, because I want this project to succeed. I mean, I've been here since the Kickstarter days, like I put it always in the description. I've been a volunteer for now, I think 6 events. 3 times Gamescom, 3 Citizencons. Could be 7, I'm not entirely sure, something like that. I've given CIG both a lot of my money and a lot of my time, so yeah. I'm invested in seeing it succeed, and quite frankly, I want every game to be a good, successful game, because it's better for all of us who want to be playing games. So, and yeah, enough rambling and babbling. Thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye.